Hi, I'm Jeremy Knindike, and you're listening to Forced from Home, a podcast about global displacement. Early in the morning on Saturday, January 3rd, the U.S. military carried out an almost video game-style operation in Venezuela to capture its president, Nicolas Maduro, a longtime antagonist of President Trump. The U.S. has now indicted him for narco-terrorism and drug trafficking and brought him to a U.S. prison. But this decapitation of the Venezuelan government did not produce the kind of democratic transition the Trump administration has long called for going to President Trump's first term in office. Instead, the U.S. backed Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president and a longtime ally of his, to lead the country instead. And the U.S. began sidelining opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Corina Machado, even discouraging her from returning to the country. An important backdrop to all this, as is so often the case with this administration, is immigration. Around 8 million Venezuelans have fled state collapse and persecution over the past decade. Around 600,000 of them had been granted temporary protected status that allowed them to live legally in the U.S. But just a few months after removing Maduro, Trump's Department of Homeland Security declared that Venezuela was no longer unsafe, and therefore that displaced Venezuelans could, quote, now go home to a country that they love, unquote. Now, the reality is the removal of Maduro has done basically nothing to resolve the political repression, corruption, and economic collapse that forced millions of Venezuelans to flee. Fast forward then to June 24, just 2 weeks ago, when two massive earthquakes of 7.2 and 7.5 magnitude struck the country. They are among the strongest earthquakes to have hit the country in over a century. In Caracas and some of the surrounding states, hundreds of buildings have collapsed or sustained serious damage. Power lines have been damaged. Medical care at hospitals has been disrupted. Several thousand people have so far been confirmed to have died. At least 16,000, probably higher, are displaced and homeless, and potentially tens of thousands remain unaccounted for. And this has created an interesting moment. The Venezuelan government sees the disaster response as an opportunity to try and burnish and restore some of its credibility and its global legitimacy. The U.S. has dived in to tout its strong relief partnership with the Delcy Rodriguez regime. And in fact, a picture has gone viral on Venezuelan Instagram of U.S. Chargé d'Affaires John M. Barrett, he's basically the acting ambassador, engaging with the Minister of Interior, Justice, and Peace, Diosdado Cabello Rondon, who, interestingly, the U.S. government has put under sanctions for alleged narco-terror links, and who, when the Trump administration came into office at the beginning of 2025, they actually increased the U.S. Rewards for Justice program bounty on him from $10 million to $25 million for his alleged role in narcotics trafficking and narcoterrorism. And now you have the senior U.S. diplomatic representative in the country almost arm in arm with him working on this disaster response together. So while the Trump administration sits around conference tables with the regime that it claims to have overthrown and makes common cause with people it has put under sanction and under bounty, you have still millions of Venezuelans displaced overseas, wondering if and when it will become safe for them to go home. And they are seeing this increasing coziness between the U.S. government and the regime that they fled, even as the U.S. government tries to claim that it is safe for them to go back. So to help us navigate all of that, I sat down with Ana Maria Diez, a Venezuelan refugee leader and human rights lawyer, to talk about the earthquake response effort and the protracted humanitarian crisis that is the backdrop to that effort. And we also talk about the prospects for refugees returning to Venezuela and how the lack of real political progress in the country and increasingly the apparent disinterest of the U.S. government in a real political transition there is affecting refugees' willingness to return home. And hang on afterwards for our news roundup, where we will cover a few of the other major displacement headlines that we're tracking this week. So I'm really pleased to welcome Ana Maria Diez to the show. Ana Maria is the co-founder and president of the Coalición por Venezuela, the largest network of Venezuelan migrants and refugees across 23 countries. With a legal background and several master's degrees and nearly a decade of humanitarian experience in the field, Ana has represented the Coalición in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Advisory Board, and she coordinates the civil society mechanism of the Quito process for the Latin America region. She has received the prestigious 2024 McCall Pierpoli Humanitarian Award from us here at Refugees International for her work. She is an alumna of the Refugees International Refugee Fellows Program, one of our inaugural class of refugee fellows several years ago, and so is a great part of our extended Refugees International family. And Ana Maria, it's great to welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. Always a pleasure.
Ana Maria is joining us today to talk about the current headlines out of Venezuela. There were a devastating pair of earthquakes that struck the coastal areas of the country now just over 2 weeks ago. As of the time of this recording, more than 3,000 people are confirmed to have been killed. More than 11,000 are injured. 16,000 have been confirmed as displaced and homeless as a result of the quakes. And all of those figures are likely underestimates because there are as many as perhaps tens of thousands of people still missing and unaccounted for. And of course, that's all happening against the backdrop of years of mismanagement, a deep economic crisis in the country, a political and governance crisis and social crisis in the country. And so it is a fast onset disaster on top of a very long-term disaster that's been affecting the country for many years. So, Ana Maria, you're in touch with many people on the ground. Can you give us a sense of just what is the state of play in terms of the fallout from this earthquake and the recovery operation that's underway?
Yeah, to be honest with my friends, my neighbors, because my home was in Caracas, actually in Los Palos Grandes, which is one of the ground zero areas of the earthquake. It's what they tell me is just heartbreaking. The situation is chaotic, and when you hear those numbers of people dead and people injured without the capacity for the country to provide medical assistance or emergency assistance, there are so many people who have lost their homes, their family, and it's already terrifying because we just had 600 replicas of the earthquakes with less scale, but they are replicas. So this brings up again the trauma that they just felt. But on the ground, everyone knows that the real numbers are much, much higher. And right now, hospitals are overwhelmed. They already had no supplies before the earthquake. So now they are trying to treat thousands of people injured with barely any electricity or clean water or medicine or doctors to respond to this crisis. And people are literally sleeping in squares, in the streets, because they are terrified of the aftershock, but also because their homes are completely destroyed. And it's a crisis on top of an existing crisis. And honestly, people are just exhausted and scared.
What is happening? You mentioned the hospitals, even before the quake, were not well supplied, were understaffed. How has the provision of basic life-sustaining services been affected by the quake? And what kind of aid are you hearing about that's getting in so far?
The first responders was neighbors, civil society. And there is something magical around the Venezuelan people. It's that despite all odds, they are just prepared to help each other. But there is a lack of overall coordination. We have seen humanitarian assistance and rescue brigades from all over the world, which is something beautiful. And we were just chatting among us that the real World Cup was happening in Venezuela. We have seen brigades from all over the world, that the ones just flying to the ground zero area to help each other. And we have seen even brigades from countries that are openly against the Venezuelan regime. So solidarity was all over the places. But despite that, the Venezuelan government didn't respond for the first 3 days. We see only videos and photos and people just claiming, please help us. And we see military men in the field with arms, not with shovels, not helping trying to rescue people. And that's something that's clearly all over the places. And it's been something on and on in the Venezuelan context. And as for more long-term responses, we now have seen that the US announced $100 million in aid. And it's definitely something that caught a lot of people by surprise, especially after all of the funding cuts. But we have to look after the political context. Since the US raid and captured Maduro, the relationships with the new administration, the new temporary administration in Caracas, has shifted quickly. And while $100 million is a lot of money, it is desperately needed. My main worry is how that money gets distributed. Is it through the same regime that has created this humanitarian crisis pre-existing in Venezuela? I say that it needs to go directly to the local organizations and the humanitarian partners who are actually doing this work, not to get lost in the political games or bureaucracy. And there is something that caught my attention is that John Barrett, which is the Church of Affairs of the US Embassy in Caracas, there is this iconic picture from, I think it's 1 or 2 days ago, patting on the back of Diosdado Cabello, which is a strongman of Maduro and Dulce, head of the repression bodies in Venezuela, with a $25 million US reward on his head by the State Department. So there are these contradictory messages that we are, as Venezuelans, receiving. And of course, we are worried how this humanitarian system will be distributed. So this is one of the main concerns that we have.
So the U.S. Charge d'Affaires is in a photo actively kind of palling around with someone that the U.S. government actively has a ransom on?
Yes, exactly.
That is astonishing. It's astonishing.
It is all over the media outlets, and it's distributed by the Venezuelan regime communication outlets. So they are bragging about it.
And this is a Maduro guy.
Yes,
yeah.
This is the Minister of Justice, actually the one that leads all of the repression brigades and system.
So that raises some really fundamental challenges and questions about how the U.S. is approaching the assistance operation. You said a moment ago you would want to see the humanitarian relief and recovery assistance flow through Venezuelan civil society organizations. You're nervous about it flowing through organizations close to the government or through the government. Say a little bit more about how that should ideally work and what are some of the things that the U.S. and other donors ought to be prioritizing now as the situation shifts from a rescue operation to a recovery process.
I think the US government has so many leverage in this, and they can help the civil society in Venezuela, which is prepared, that it's ready to assist, and they have been trained in the humanitarian principles. But remember that Venezuela is under 26 plus years of dictatorship regime that has installed this repression system that enables massive surveillance on the civil society. And there is this anti-NGOs law in Venezuela that is still in place that forbids new organizations to actively have a single registration or operate without the approval of the regime. And I think the US should advocate for the removal of this law, but also set the balances in place to have these organizations to actively work. And also, we have seen in the news some of the concerns that the UN President Coordinator says that he had UN staffers in the airport that were unable to enter the country because they didn't receive good to go from the government. So they are just having everything handled by themselves, which worries us 10 times more.
So there's an opportunity here to reinforce the role of civil society in Venezuela, but there's also a risk that the government will try to use this to just reinforce some of the tools of repression that it has traditionally used. And when the Charge d'Affaires of the US government is doing a photo op with one of the symbolic leaders of that repression in the government, that's not an encouraging sign. That's such an important point. And it gets to, this is a credibility test for the Venezuelan regime, but also for some of the things the US has said it wants to see from that regime versus, I think, the track record we've seen so far, where it hasn't really been all that concerned with human rights and civil society and democratization in Venezuela. And that, I think, is a good segue to something that we also wanted to ask you about, which is, of course, the people displaced by the earthquake are coming on top of millions of people who have been displaced from Venezuela over the past few years by that repression, by the mismanagement by the government and the economic collapse that has made life untenable for many Venezuelans. According to the UN, almost 8 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants have left the country, many of them seeking safety abroad, some of them in Colombia, some of them here in the United States and elsewhere. Take us back before the earthquake. What were people fleeing? Why did so many Venezuelans leave their country over the last decade?
It is crazy to think that 8.2 million persons have left. It is almost a quarter of our entire population. And people need to understand that this didn't happen overnight. This is the result of years of systemic collapse, but also of a totalitarian regime that persecuted its population. And imagine living in a country where you work full-time job and your month's salary can't even buy a single carton of eggs or doesn't reach $10 per month. And imagine your kids going to bed with hungry or having a preventable illness and knowing that you go to hospital and you might die because they don't even have clean needles or basic saline. I mean, people didn't leave Venezuela because they wanted to have an adventure. It is because of a massive humanitarian crisis. And we need to picture this because the Venezuelan crisis is the biggest in the American continent. And it's one of the biggest in the world without an armed conflict. This is something we need to use in our minds to have the proper scale of this crisis. So people just have this option of slowly dying in Venezuela or just crossing borders trying to survive. And that's the second is what happened. So imagine all of this while it is a country that has the biggest oil resources in the world. It is contradictory, but it's what totalitarian regimes do. They just have this wonderful country and use it like their own personal budget. And it is cruel, but it's what led our country to this massive humanitarian crisis.
Right. Yeah. And as you say, a combination of both state collapse on a pretty unprecedented level. And I'm glad you made this point. The unique nature of this displacement crisis, which is happening without a backdrop of armed conflict. Typically, when we see numbers on this scale in a place like Syria, for example, it's because there's a conflict that people are fleeing. Here, it is a mix of both state collapse and extreme political repression and persecution that many people have fled. And you yourself have been forced to leave Venezuela. You're among those refugees who've left the country. If you're comfortable with it, tell us a little bit about what you and your family experienced and why you had to leave.
Yeah, honestly, leaving my home was a grief that never goes away. And I have now 4 years living in Spain. And for me and my family, we got to the point that the fear was just a constant in our lives. I was working in the humanitarian field in Venezuela and doing my best, surviving basically, and also at the same time trying to help each other, helping others. But dealing with daily blackouts that lasted 4 hours, we had even two massive blackouts that lasted over a week. And with food was incredibly scarce and the insecurity was terrifying. I was kidnapped by the national police and they asked ransom for my family in order to set me free. So when this happens on a daily basis, and I wish I could say that this happened only to me, but no, this happened on a daily basis. So when this happens, it was like a breaking point for me. I was no longer safe. I was seeing no future. I was so burned out, but also so scared. And there was no possibility for me to help others in that state. So that's when I looked to my family and realized that no matter how hard I can work, things were not going to change. And The police keep returning to my home, asking for more because they knew that I was working in the humanitarian field and leaving everything behind, my friends, my home, my entire life, my career. And with just a couple of suitcases was the only way to find hope. And we felt that we had no choice because honestly, I had no choice.
Yeah. Do you think you were targeted for political reasons, or was it just economic? They thought they could get some money for ransom?
Actually, when I was captured, one of my neighbors was captured as well. It was like something random, and it happens on a daily basis, as I said. We have some emblematic cases of political prisoners that they're still in prison. But no, it was not my case. I was a regular humanitarian worker. They knew that I was working in this, but they didn't knew what my neighbor was doing. So it was something happening on and on.
So it speaks to almost the universality of the repression in Venezuela by the Maduro regime, now the Delcy Rodriguez regime. And was that under the justice minister that you mentioned earlier? Was he the person in place at that time?
Yeah, back on those days, he was the president of the National Assembly.
Okay.
So it's the same person.
Okay. And so you, after this abduction and continued threats and intimidation against your household and your family, you finally fled the country and went to Spain. And has anything changed with that risk since Maduro's abduction? Is there any improvement that you see in the risks that yourself or others face?
Let's put it this way. Let's say that the big chief of the gang was in prison, but they left behind the whole gang. That's what's happening in Venezuela. And it is the same repressive system with the same people in charge. And now with some exchange support from the US diplomatic bodies, and nothing has changed. We have seen the same repression to the civil society in Venezuela. We have seen the same people that persecuted us and forced us to flee, leading the country still. So there are no guarantees for us to safely return home.
And part of the reason I ask about that is the Trump administration has revoked protections that the United States had put in place for Venezuelans. So more than 600,000 Venezuelans had been receiving protection in the United States through temporary protected status. But Trump's Department of Homeland Security revoked those protections earlier this year after the abduction of Maduro and claimed that by, in their words, quote, bringing justice to an illegitimate narco-terrorist dictator, Venezuelans can now go home to a country they love. You're obviously painting a very different picture here, that while Maduro is gone, the system that he presided over, that system of persecution that touched you and so many others, is still intact. And do you think there's any prospect for change? And are you seeing much inclination for return? Are Venezuelans taking another look at going home since Maduro's departure? Or is the community of displaced Venezuelans abroad still viewing the risks as the same as they ever were?
Honestly, Jeremy, saying that Venezuelans can just go home now because Maduro was captured is incredibly out of touch with reality. Taking away protections for over 600,000 Venezuelans right now, it's not only dangerous, but it's illogic. Yes, Maduro is gone, but as I say, a dictatorship isn't just one man. The entire system, the corruption, the armed groups, the complete economic collapse is still fully intact. And now, on top of that, we just had two massive earthquakes that destroy entire towns. And you cannot wave a magic wand and say, yeah, it's safe, go back. Because there is no running water, there is no electricity, there is a humanitarian disaster over a pre-existing humanitarian disaster happening as we speak. And returning right now is not only impossible, but it's almost highly unsafe. How this is compatible with safe return home. It is not.
Are you hearing any reports from people who have gone back over the last 6 months? I know there have been some people who were trying to reach the United States or trying to reach safety elsewhere, have not been able to do so now, given the change in policy in the US, and have turned around. Is anyone going back, and what are they experiencing when they return?
Yeah, there was a turning point for Venezuelans, which was the capture of Maduro on January 3rd. And there was this small group of people that instantly returned home because, it's hope, things will change. But now we've seen reports of people trying to find alternatives. And many of those alternatives, it's right now Spain. So we have a third and a fourth wave of people trying to live in Venezuela. It was a constant nightmare. And unfortunately, there is this three-step process that the Secretary of State Rubio has keep saying that there is a plan for Venezuela. But if we contrast this with the context in Venezuela, last week was the limit from our constitution, from the 108 days of complete absence of the president to call for new elections. And none of this has happened. And we have seen no coming communications, nor from the State Department, not from Delcy Rodriguez or anyone in the government. So we have seen excuses for just keep going, functioning as usual. And in the middle, people is leaving home. Now people from La Guaira, it's leaving because they lost their homes. What else can they lose?
And I think the incentives for the US government here have potentially really flipped, because when Maduro was in power, they were very anti-Maduro, but that also meant acknowledging that the country was not a safe place for return. If they now, because of their immigration policy, need to portray Venezuela as totally fine and totally safe for people to return to, then that basically means having to accept and legitimize the Delcy Rodriguez government. And it's fascinating the point you're making about elections here, that the US doesn't necessarily have an incentive anymore to talk about good governance or reform in Venezuela, if that in effect undermines their case for revoking the temporary protected status protections. And I think you see that also in how they're approaching the earthquake response, this really lockstep approach with the Venezuelan regime, which, as you say, apart from Maduro no longer being there, is still fully the Maduro regime. One thing you and I have talked about before is the political rights of refugees. That we often, in kind of global discourse on refugees, we talk about right to work, right to education. We don't always think about or talk about political rights. And you raising the election here, I think it is important. If there are 8 million Venezuelans outside the country, do they get to vote? What do Venezuelan refugees want to see if and when there is an election in Venezuela? What sort of rights do they want to have?
We want to have the ability to choose. We have chosen, but there is not ongoing conversation on how the Venezuelans abroad can vote, nor restructuring of the government. We have so many laws set in place, and we are not talking about this. We have the general attorney that was not transparently elected, nor rebuilding institutions, not rebuilding the trust of the people. So there are a lot of pending conversations that are not happening right now. So our biggest concern is that the crisis that now just happened keeps delaying those conversations, because civil society will keep pushing for those changes. We want to safely return home, but we want to have a home to return to. And that implies safe government, safe space to grow, to rebuild our lives, to have open conversations about justice, about victims, about freedom. We want to have free media, which we don't fully have. And so many things are still pending to talk about.
And an important point you just made, that for the most part, most of the 8 million Venezuelans who fled the country would want to return home if it were safe and possible to do so, but they don't have confidence that it is. And I would imagine that the sort of behavior that we're seeing out of the Trump administration of not following through on the political rights, not following through on the constitutional requirement of holding an election after the protracted absence of the head of state, and showing this new closeness with the regime that they had fled in the first place, all of those things I would imagine have to undermine the confidence of Venezuelan refugees that it is safe for them to return home. So is the Trump administration working against its own objectives here if they want Venezuelans to go back by having this new closeness with the regime?
We have been heartbroken twice because we have lost most of our hopes because of after almost 30 years trying to find peaceful solutions to this, to the International Criminal Court, with an Inter-American Human Rights Commission, with so many bodies and in the world. We were trying to find a solution, peaceful solutions. And when the Trump administration seize and capture Maduro, we finally say, oh, maybe there is justice. But this doesn't look like justice to us because it's just, I don't want to get into political detail, but nothing has changed for the Venezuelans.
And you yourself, as we talked about earlier, are a refugee who's had to flee Venezuela. You have co-founded the largest global coalition of Venezuelan refugee organizations, the Coalición por Venezuela, a coalition of Venezuelan civil society groups and refugee organizations. And you've represented the coalition on UNHCR's advisory board. Tell us a little bit about, as a leader of the refugee-led movement, both kind of for Venezuelans, but also I think more broadly, the global movement for greater refugee leadership. How has the coalition tried to take that forward? What was your vision in founding this group? And why is it important for refugees to be represented at the table with organizations and institutions like UNHCR that exist to support and work for refugees?
I will say that the most powerful thing in the work for refugees is collective action. And Coalition was one of those initiatives. We are not the only one of Venezuelans led, but we are one of those collective voices that keep advocating for the Venezuelan crisis. And with comes and goes of the politics in Latin America and all over the world, it's easy to find this more new crisis, let's say it, to talk about and keep forgetting those more protected. So keeping alive the Venezuelan conversation in every single space was something critical for us, especially considering that the Venezuelan crisis is not fully recognized as a refugee crisis. So we keep receiving like 7, 8 different categories, temporary visas that keeps us on the move. Whenever a country decides to revoke one of the temporary protection measures that they install, we keep on the move. So for us, it was critical to have these voices alive, talking about Venezuela, having some changes, and also opening some doors for other crises less visibilized. For example, the Nicaraguan crisis and the collective voice, but also the voices of those living this crisis, it's 10 times more important. We are the ones living the consequences of good or bad politics that affects directly our lives, that keep us on the move, or give us a safe space to grow while we cannot get back home. So it is mandatory for us to keep advocating for voices on the table.
And you're one of the earliest activists who's been pushing for refugee representation in global decision-making bodies. You're on the UNHCR advisory group now, but that hasn't been an easy road. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the challenges that you faced as a refugee leader seeking representation in those spaces?
I can provide a very good example because the UNHCR advisory board is one of those very broad, open spaces, but there was few other spaces not so open to civil society participation. And specifically for the Venezuelan crisis, there was the Quito process, which was an intergovernmental space created by governments of Latin America to respond to the Venezuelan crisis. And early days, it was this space where prime ministers and presidents gather in a table to discuss about government decisions to provide solutions to the Venezuelan crisis. But there was not a single voice of a Venezuelan in the table saying, this will work, this will not. Let's hear each other. So early days, we were advocating for a civil society space in this mechanism. And we finally achieved it last year. And the Quito process was functioning since 2018.
Wow.
It was a long shot. So the times that the governments handle is not the same time frame for a people that is forced to flee. And we have to keep in mind that every single day that we advocate for changes or restructuring spaces like this, it's not easy, but it was something. And advocacy is one of the most complicated things that I had to work on, because humanitarian assistance is something that we can directly work from day one, but advocacy takes a long shot.
Yeah.
But I'm happy that we did it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a dynamic that we see across a lot of different crises. When you have governments coming together to talk about a refugee crisis, often it's governments talking to other governments and not necessarily talking in a serious way to the refugees themselves. Sometimes traditionally you might have a refugee voice there in a tokenistic way. Groups like yours have been fighting to break out of that tokenistic mold.
Yeah, and there is another thing, another step that we have worked on, and this is me personally, is that the Independent Declaration on the Right to Participate. It's an independent declaration made of incredibly professionals from all over the world, that it's a guideline for governments to include those refugee or forcibly displaced-led voices and how to integrate it in their government decisions to make it more inclusive from day one. So it's a guideline. It is what it is. And I think it's something to find very useful beyond advisory boards and mechanisms like this.
And we'll include a link to the text of that in the show notes. And that right to participate is so critical. It really animates a lot of the work that we do here at Refugees International. It's why we've partnered with you and other people who've come through our Refugee Fellows program, because we, like you do, believe it's essential that refugees be at the table and helping to drive the conversations about their own displacement. And that traditionally has not been the case. It's changing, fortunately, but that change is slow. And as you've described, it takes sometimes years of fighting to get that recognized. How has the refugee-led movement around Venezuela and some of the organizations involved in that been involved in the response to the current earthquake?
Wow, it's been massive. I think one of the good things of being forced to flee is that we are already in thousands of different locations ready to help our country. So we have seen, and you can say through members, the NGO members of Coalition, but also through different spontaneous manifestations in the world of people bringing humanitarian assistance to different places, trying to ship those to Venezuela, trying to fundraise, trying to visualize humanitarian needs. So it's been something that reinforces the claim that we are one single nation, connected, not split out. We are connected to our homeland, and it's just present every day.
So let's end where we always do in this podcast, which is on disinformation and misinformation. One of the aims that we have with the podcast is to try and counter some of the disinformation that is out there on refugee and displacement issues. Obviously, there has been a lot of misinformation and disinformation about Venezuelans. Is there one piece of that misinformation, disinformation that you would like to specifically set the record straight on?
Yes, of course. We Venezuelans didn't know how to live abroad. We were historically a home, a place where everyone was welcome. And I grew up with people from different nationalities that flee their own countries, running away from dictatorship regimes or humanitarian crisis or you name it. And I myself, I am the daughter of a Spaniard that flee Franco's devastation of Spain and found a safe haven in Venezuela. So I really want people to understand that nobody wants to be a refugees. We Venezuelans don't want to be a refugees or forcibly displaced person. Nobody wakes up and decides to abandon their culture, their family, their homes, no matter how hard it was. And it's been an incredibly painful road for us Venezuelans. But there is a narrative that sometimes displaced people is just looking for an easy way out or to take advantage of other countries' system. That's not true. We just want to have a safe place to grow, to try to rebuild our lives, and hopefully getting back home soon. So keep that in mind. We're just people grieving, and we just want to rebuild our lives alongside yours.
That's a great place to wrap up. Ana Maria, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us here today. And we'll share in hopes and best wishes for a better future for Venezuela.
Thank you for the invitation. Big hug to everyone.
Before we turn to the news roundup, we want to put a human face on the cruelty of the Trump administration's treatment of Venezuelan refugees and asylum seekers with the firsthand testimony of a woman who Refugees International met with in Costa Rica as she was attempting to return back to Venezuela after spending several years in Mexico waiting for an appointment that would have legally allowed her to seek refuge in the United States. After the Trump administration ended the program that would have allowed that, she began trying to return home, and she is homeless multiple times over.
Soy venezolana, tengo mis dos hijos. Cuando salí de acá de Venezuela, salí en el 2024.
My name is Maria. I'm Venezuelan. I have 2 children. I left Venezuela in August of 2024. It took us quite a while, about 3 months, to get to Mexico. We left for Mexico through Colombia. We went through the jungle. We spent about 8 days in the jungle. When we arrived to Chiquito, Panama, we stayed there for about 3 days and started again, continuing on to the next country. We went to Panama, then to Costa Rica for about 2 weeks, then to Nicaragua. We went through Nicaragua until we arrived in Mexico. We arrived in Mexico, and upon arriving, we were kidnapped.
Como una semana nada más, de Nicaragua pasamos así. Y bueno, hasta que nos llegamos a México y allí en México, llegando a México, allí, pues a nosotros
We were
nos
kidnapped and
secuestraron.
held for
Nos
about
secuestraron
20
también,
days.
duramos
They
como
demanded
20
a
días
ransom.
secuestrados, y pidieron
They
una
weren't
cantidad de
asking for
dinero.
dollars for each of us
Nos
because I
estaban
had
pidiendo $1,000
kids,
por cada
but
uno,
still
porque
needed money
yo
from
tengo mis
me.
hijos y yo
And we, my
quedarme
family, didn't have
mi
anything.
familia no
That
tenía
amount,
nada de
what
esa
my
cantidad.
family
Mi
was
familia
able
pudo
to manage
llegar,
to pay
fueron
was money my whole
pagando
family in
dólares entre
Venezuela had to
todas las familias
gather.
empezaron a poner
They
que
started
estaban
sending money
asfixiados.
because they were
Y
very
después nos soltaron,
distressed.
y
Then
llegamos
the kidnappers
a
released
México.
us.
Nosotros
We made
llegamos
it to
a la
the
frontera de
Mexican
México.
border. We were
Ahí
there for
llegamos
about 2 months.
como
We arrived and started requesting an
eh,
appointment through
empezamos,
CBP-1.
empezamos a pedir la cita. No, llegamos a Tulas Gutiérrez. En Tulas Gutiérrez duramos como 2 meses. Y después de 2 meses de Tulas Gutiérrez nos fuimos para a Ciudad de México. Y en la Ciudad de
We
México
went to
empezamos a pedir,
Tuxtla Gutierrez, and we
empezamos a pedir la
stayed there for
cita,
about
la
2
cita para
months.
pasar a los Estados Unidos.
After those 2 months,
Y
we went
después,
to
bueno, fuimos
Mexico
para
City and started requesting an appointment to cross into the United
bueno,
States.
ahí a donde
Then
estábamos
we
más
went
cerca
to the
de
US
Estados Unidos para
border
la
and
frontera.
stayed waiting. We had to request another appointment and another appointment and another appointment. Then the elections came and they started canceling appointments. They started sending people back. Immigration started arresting people. In fact, immigration arrested my son. He was there for 5 days. I had to file a claim because we explained to the lawyers that we were thinking of returning because of the situation in Mexico was too difficult to stay in those circumstances.
Que nosotros no teníamos piensos de devolvernos porque allá la situación era fuerte para estar allí, pues en México en esas circunstancias, o sea, no teníamos, o sea, era muy fuerte, pues. Y más que yo estaba viajando sola con mis hijos.
We were already struggling. It was very difficult, and even more so because I was traveling alone with my children. It was just my children and me, and it was really very, very, very difficult. I went back to Mexico City, and we were there for about 5 months. Then we decided to go back south again. And as we went back to each country, we stayed for a month, 2 months, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. In Costa Rica, we didn't stay long, around 15 days. Then I went to Colombia.
Y de ahí empezamos ahí. Yo me fui para Colombia. En Colombia también duré como un mes, 2 meses. Y yo llegué acá en abril. En abril llegué el 7 de abril. Llegué
Right now, the situation is too much with everything that's been happening in Venezuela. First, because of the president here in Venezuela, which was the worst, and now the earthquake. This has no words. This is something too terrible for all of us Venezuelans who lived through it. And I was so close to where it happened that more than 200 or so buildings fell and covered up all those people who were there in that place. My building didn't collapse, but it was very affected. They had to evacuate people out. I hadn't lived there for long. I had just moved there.
Pero a donde nosotros vivimos no se derrumbó el edificio, pero sí quedó muy afectado, pues sacaron a la gente de allí, y yo no tenía mucho tiempo viviendo allí, yo me había mudado allí, imagínense.
Now we have to stay at relatives' houses, and people who don't have family close by sleep in tents. Sometimes we have to sleep in tents too. We don't have anything left. In other words, there's no other option because everyone is very affected. There are more dead people, and they are still taking them out. In fact, today they took out a family that was complete, the 2 children, the husband, and the wife, thankfully still alive, but there are many more people still under the rubble who are alive.
Los hijos, el esposo y la esposa están vivos, hay muchísima gente todavía abajo de los escombros que están vivas. Pero de verdad que esto es muy demasiado terrible para un país, de verdad que sí.
Truly, this is very terrible for our country. But as a Venezuelan and as a child of God, I continue to believe in what God is doing despite everything we are experiencing. He is with us. We continue to believe, and God bless all the people who survived. This has been very, very difficult for everyone. This is a very strong, very tremendous thing for everyone and for what we experienced. It is too much, but well, that's how it is, everything we have lived through.
Fue demasiado fuerte. Pero bueno, así es todo lo que hemos vivido.
So now for our roundup of displacement stories that we're tracking around the world this week. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court passed down a decision in favor of the Trump administration on temporary protected status, which is a legal status that the U.S. government can grant to people who are present in the United States and cannot safely return to their home country, whether that's because of war or major disaster or other reasons that make it unsafe to return or insecure to return home. Normally, once that status is issued, it cannot just be arbitrarily changed if there hasn't been a major change in conditions in the country. But the Supreme Court has now ruled otherwise and ruled that the Trump administration does have the authority to arbitrarily strip protection from hundreds of thousands of people with TPS and deport them to harm with limited judicial review. These are people who have often been longstanding, valuable members of U.S. communities, who contribute tremendously to the U.S. economy and U.S. society. As one example, in the immediate term, this means that more than 350,000 people from Haiti and Syria who are living in working in the U.S. and contributing in their communities are likely to lose their work authorization and their legal protections and become vulnerable to deportation. While there are still details to work out in the lower courts, this is a huge blow both to those people who have sought protection in the United States and to the many communities across the country that have welcomed them and appreciated and welcomed the contributions that they have made. Congress can take action to protect people with TPS and to preserve this critical pathway to protection. If you support that, as I imagine you probably do if you're listening to this show, please visit our Take Action page on the Refugees International website or look for the link that we will drop in the show notes and write to your member of Congress, telling them that you support TPS, you support access to refuge for the 1.3 million people who can't safely return to their home countries no matter what arbitrary determinations the Trump administration may try to make. And we will talk more about this in a future episode with an upcoming deep dive into TPS, the fallout from the Supreme Court decision, and the impact that will have on people seeking refuge here and the communities that have welcomed them. Next, turning again to the growing Ebola outbreak in DRC that we talked about a few weeks ago, things are not going well. The confirmed cases are now up to 1,561 as of a few days ago. That is now almost halfway to the size of the huge Ebola outbreak in Eastern Congo from 2018 to 2020, which reached 3,400 cases, a little over twice as many, but took 2 years to do that. This outbreak was only confirmed about a month and a half ago, so for it to nearly be halfway to the total of that 2-year outbreak, which, by the way, was the second largest outbreak of Ebola ever, is pretty concerning, and it looks very clear that this outbreak will surpass that one. It continues to rage beyond control with an international response effort that so far has been pretty underpowered and continues to be outpaced by the virus itself. One spot of hopeful news from that is that the World Health Organization has now announced a trial for some experimental treatments to treat people with Ebola and hopefully improve the survivability of this species of the disease. As we've talked about in the past, or as you may have read about, because this is the Bundibugyo species, a different species of Ebola than most of the large outbreaks in the past, there is no vaccine and there are currently no approved therapeutic treatments for it. If this trial is successful, that would enable a proven therapeutic treatment and hopefully improve survivability and save some lives. And finally, you may have seen, if you've been following the World Cup as obsessively as all of us here at Refugees International, the controversy over the last few days about the red card that was given to star U.S. player Folarin Balogun and then overturned by FIFA at the request of President Trump. Now, we are recording this on the afternoon before the U.S.-Belgium game. We don't know the outcome that may have. Needless to say, there are a lot of opinions. But one thing that I think hasn't gotten as much attention as it should is that the irony and the hypocrisy of the Trump administration intervening on behalf of this particular player who, if the Trump administration had its way, would not be on the U.S. team at all. Folarin Balogun is a U.S. citizen through birthright citizenship. His mother happened to be in the United States when he was born, but otherwise he grew up in the U.K. And the Trump administration just went all the way to the Supreme Court and fortunately lost, attempting to overturn birthright citizenship. And had they succeeded in that, the U.S. might be down its star player. Interestingly, Balogun is hardly the only migrant or refugee who has been a key player for a World Cup team. Al Jazeera had a really interesting report a little while ago looking at all of the different players on many different squads that came from refugee backgrounds. People like Alphonso Davies from the Canadian team, who was born in 2000 in a refugee camp in Ghana after his parents had fled Liberia's civil war and became Canadian by virtue of his family resettling to Canada when he was 5. Eduardo Camavinga of France, who was born in a refugee camp in Angola after his parents fled the war in the DRC. Nigerian winger, and now Nigeria is not in the cup this year, but Nigerian winger Victor Moses was resettled in the UK after his parents were killed in religious clashes in Nigeria in 2002. Nestori Irankunda of Australia was born in a refugee camp in Tanzania after his parents fled Burundi's civil war. And then other players are former refugees who are now again playing for their original home countries. So Iraqi striker Ali Al-Hamadi had fled Iraq with his family after his father had been jailed by Saddam Hussein's regime. And the Bosnian team in particular has many players who had fled the country as children during the civil war there and grown up overseas and now reunited to play for their team. And friend of Refugees International, Baroness Arminka Helic, who is a member of the UK House of Lords, but first came to the UK as a refugee from Bosnia in the 1990s, wrote a great piece a few days ago talking about the important role that refugees had played in really as the core of the Bosnian team and what that has meant for Bosnia and Bosnian identity to see that team of so many former refugees playing together. It's a really wonderful, powerful, and inspiring piece, and we will drop a link to that in the show notes. I think an underappreciated but really important story now of the biggest sports event in the world. How much different national teams have depended on immigrants and refugees in order to be competitive. And just one more example of the many ways that welcoming refugees and migrants can strengthen a society and also make it a little bit better at football. Thanks so much, and see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to Forced From Home on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the episode, consider donating to support our work at refugiesinternational.org or the link in our show notes. For more, follow Refugees International on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and stay tuned for more Forced From Home episodes coming soon.